I'm Chance Dorland, and in San Antonio, military means local. This is Military City, a new podcast from expressnews.com, where each episode, San Antonio Express News senior reporter Sig Christensen and I discuss the military stories important to San Antonio, both from today and the past. Of course, Sig Christensen was embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division during the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 and has reported on military-related topics for decades. Today, we're talking about something that happened just a little bit before you started reporting on military topics. You have a lot of history to your name, Sig, but not this far back. Many people pausing at the 15th green at the Joint Base San Antonio Fort Sam Houston Golf Course have no idea that they are sinking putts perhaps just 25 feet from a place of death. It's just a short walk across a road and downhill through a brushy area to where 13 African-American soldiers were executed at once at 7:17 a.m. on December 11th, 1917. Now, obviously, this is a horrible piece of military history, but of course, one that is definitely worth remembering and talking about, and that's what we're going to be doing today. Sig, you recently spoke about the history of this event with the commander of the U.S. Army North, Lieutenant General Jeffrey Buchanan, who we'll be hearing from in depth in today's episode. But before we get to our first of 3 extended clips, Sig, please set the stage for what happened nearly 101 years ago.
Well, the Army had a couple of segregated units. One was in Houston, and they were based at a place called Camp Logan. Camp Logan was a training spot for soldiers in Houston as the First World War raged, and those soldiers were preparing to train for overseas duty in Europe. There was another sister unit of this organization that was in Waco, and both of them were all African-American units. And they were in cities that had serious race issues. To be blunt, Houston and Waco, along with every other place in Texas and the South in that era, were intensely racist communities. And they did not like the fact that soldiers armed with weapons were camping out on their doorstep, and that these particular soldiers were black. It invited all kinds of fears that they always had held. The whole system of Jim Crow, as we saw, the system of slavery, and the history of racial segregation and oppression was always rooted in the need of white people throughout the South to control blacks and to ensure that they could not ever be treated as equals in any way, shape, or form. Black soldiers with rifles undergoing military training was something that a lot of people in those communities couldn't stand, and it led to a lot of trouble. Ultimately, it led to court-martials at Fort Sam Houston for, if I recall correctly, 118 soldiers, and 19 of them were put to death. 17 of them still rest at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. The story of how they got there is just awful, as you said. It is a story of injustice, both in those local communities and in the Army. They had 63 of these soldiers in the first round of trials at Fort Sam Houston, represented by a single person who was not a lawyer. And these are capital offenses. They were represented by a man who was not a lawyer. And on the other side, they had lawyers prosecuting the case, and they had 2 months to prepare their case. And as I recall, this man who represented the 63 soldiers had 10 days. So just gross abuses of justice. In the end, it prompted a big change in military justice. And the justice system where there was once no avenue for appeal for a death sentence in wartime, that was immediately changed after this happened because it was such a horrific event. It sent shockwaves through the Army legal community, and it sent shockwaves across the country. And over the years, successive presidents were forced to deal with it, usually in the form of releasing prisoners or commuting sentences. So it's a terrible injustice. And what you're going to hear today from General Buchanan is how it happened in Houston and how it did not happen in Waco. How discipline enforced by respected leaders made a difference in Waco and why there was very little of it in Houston.
It's not that people aren't part of the management equation, but they're the critical component in leadership. So it's about relationships between people, up and down the chain of command, across the chain of command, peer to peer, all of that. It's that people to people relationship because at its simplest, leadership is about influence. And so those relationships are absolutely critical. So in this particular case, in the incident that led up to a series of riots across Texas, and I'll talk specifically about a situation in both Waco and Houston, kind of emanating from Camp Logan, and then the aftermath, the court martial. I think there's a lot of leadership going on, both good and bad leadership. And, the Army even demonstrated some leadership in the aftermath of this because of what they changed. So what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit, focus on those particular things. And so, the people who had attended our ceremony last week, they really understood and knew about the riot in Houston coming out of Camp Logan and then the aftermath of the trial here at Fort Sam Houston, what was then called Camp Travis, and the executions that took place afterwards. But most of them had not heard about the situation in Waco, which actually occurred prior to the events in Houston. So I want to talk about that because we have a good contrast here between a good leadership demonstrated by a battalion commander and bad leadership in the battalion out of Houston. So the 3rd Battalion of the 24th Infantry, which was the one in Houston, had a sister battalion, 1st of the 24th, and they were stationed in Waco at about the same time that 324 was in Houston. And within 24 hours of arriving at Waco, the acting battalion commander of 124 was a Captain Charles Andrews. He established communications with the local police and even sent liaisons from his unit to the Waco Police Department. On the evening of the 23rd of July of 1917, when he was alerted that a number of soldiers had taken weapons and ammunition and headed out of the camp, Captain Andrews immediately communicated his concerns to the Waco police. He also conducted an accountability check for all of his troops and ordered that all weapons be secured in the unit arms racks. He posted guards on the gate, and in so doing, he's demonstrating his confidence that the battalion would adhere to his orders, which in fact that they did. There were some rioters, and they were taken into custody when they tried to get back in the gate. The very next morning, Captain Andrews attended a local civic meeting where he explained that the rioters were acting spontaneously and were only about a dozen of his troops. He asked that the city not view this as anything that was premeditated and certainly not behavior that he tolerated of his men in the unit. And largely because of the relationship he'd established with the local police and his proactive communication, in addition to the discipline standards that he imposed, the mayor of Waco asked the citizens of Waco in the next day's newspaper to not hold all the soldiers in the battalion liable for the actions of a few and not to engage in racial slurs against the soldiers.
What you will see Buchanan talk about here is really about the nature of leadership. And he's studied the issue, and as a 3-star general, it's incumbent on him to be a leader. And he talks about why leadership is not management and what constitutes leadership. And you're going to see here that the commander in Houston is an exceptionally poor leader. And you're going to find that the leader in Waco, even though he graduated at the bottom of his class at West Point, was actually a very good leader. And one of them stops a riot from getting out of hand. There are riots in both places, but one of them is pretty much stopped almost as soon as it starts. And then the commander in Waco diffuses the situation very neatly. He has a clear grasp of the people he's dealing with, and he knows how to approach them and to get them to negotiate. In Houston, the horrific violence that takes place as a result of the rioting there is a direct result of one really bad leader who was really, on top of everything else, a coward.
So let's compare that or contrast it with the leadership of Major Nealon Snow, who was the recently promoted battalion commander of 3rd Battalion of the 24th in Houston. Well before the night of the riot, Major Snow established himself as someone who cared more for his personal interest than for that of his men. He enjoyed the opportunity to be stationed in Houston for the social life that it offered. And he was frequently out playing golf and out on the town, leaving the day-to-day running of the battalion to one of his officers. When his men tried to alert him of the growing concerns, he accused them of overreacting. And on the evening of 23 August 1917, just about a month after that situation in Waco, Major Snow was on his way out of camp for the night on the town when one of his soldiers warned him that trouble was brewing. He initially tried to brush him off, but the NCO insisted that he come along and see what was going on. When he saw the men taking ammunition from the supply tents, he mustered the battalion. But instead of acknowledging how bad the abuse had been and stating that he was going to address the problems, he trivialized what had gone on. As the first shots were fired and then chaos broke out, some of his men ran in to try to stop it. Major Snow ran the other way. He called the former Houston police chief, screaming and demanding help. And after this, he fled from the camp and flagged down a civilian vehicle, insisting that the driver take him away to save his life. While Major Snow is one of the poorest examples of a leader we can find, the 324 was not without good leaders. First Lieutenant Bartlett James was the goat of his class at West Point, meaning that he was the last person in his class academically that actually graduated. While not a strong start, Lieutenant James quickly became well respected by the men in his company. As the chaos started on August 23rd, Lieutenant James exhorted his soldiers not to join in the mutiny. As the mutineers approached his company and attempted to get his soldiers to come with them, Lieutenant James stood in the street between the mutineers and his soldiers and continued to urge them not to go. Another good example was Captain Shakurjian. He was an Armenian immigrant whose family narrowly escaped death in Turkey. Captain Shakurjian was the battalion adjutant, and he was the guy that Major Snow usually tasked with running the battalion when he was out on the town. On the evening of 23 August, Captain Shakurjian tried to pull soldiers out of ranks of the mutineers. He acknowledged that wrongs had been done and promised to do what he could to address those wrongs. Even though the mutineers had him at gunpoint, Captain Shakurjian continued to do everything he could to persuade soldiers not to go into town. And I focused so far on officers' leaders, but I also want to talk about the importance of NCO leadership. During the month or so before the 1917 Houston riot, 26 of the senior non-commissioned officers of 324 were selected to be among the first black officers, and they were sent off to training. Without getting into specifics, that's a huge percentage of turnover in the NCO leadership, and this resulted in very young and inexperienced soldiers rising quickly to NCO ranks that they were not adequately prepared to fill. The senior NCOs who'd been selected for school were veterans of 3 wars. They were no doubt role models to the junior enlisted soldiers, and they themselves wrote in a letter that the Houston riot would not have happened had they been there. It's also worth noting that the senior NCOs in 124 and Waco were in place during the July incident. Their leadership presence, along with the strong leadership of Captain Andrews, kept discipline intact.
And then, Sig, we have one final clip of your discussion with Lieutenant General Jeffrey Buchanan. Once again, a very important topic nearly 101 years ago. So thank you for bringing this to the attention of anyone hearing this episode, something that needs to be remembered. And this discussion, I think, definitely will allow that to take place. Final thoughts before we say goodbye. I know you introduced in this clip the fact that this really did all kind of have to do with one person.
It had to do with one person and his selfishness, his bad attitude, what he was there to do, his relationship with his troops. And as General Buchanan points out, there were a number of these black NCOs who had been sent to officer candidate school because they were so good. These units were very proud organizations. Those soldiers, those black soldiers, had acquitted themselves very well through years and decades on the prairie of this country, serving in Indian wars, defending white communities. Those people were not treated well. And in that era, they were not treated well. And there is a lesson here and a warning. If you fail to treat people with respect, you will reap what you sow. So the rioting that took place in Houston was the direct result of the way the Houston police and the community itself treated those black soldiers. They mistreated those soldiers. They routinely beat those soldiers. They called them names. They intimidated them. And they showed them no respect at all. Because in that society, a black man or a black woman was not supposed to have equality of any kind. And they were supposed to be subservient to their white masters. You know, the shame of this is that race is the terrible sin of our country. It goes back to the beginning of the country. It goes back to slavery, and we're still fighting it. But as General Buchanan points out, there are lessons here, and perhaps one of the most important lessons that you walk away with is that the Army, even in that time, is so much further along than the society it's defending and protecting. That's even true now. It is the most integrated organization in America. It is the place where your performance is going to determine the outcome of your career. It's a meritocracy in the purest sense, and it's what I like most about the Army and the rest of the armed forces. I was recently talking with, and this is a guy that we had on a previous podcast. He was a Marine, and he talks about how the Marine Corps was treating everybody the same way, about how your color didn't matter there. And he loved the Marine Corps because it was a merit-based group. One day, we might be able to say that about our country. We aren't there yet, but the lesson that you can see from this podcast and from having been around the Army, as I have been for a long time, the lesson is that if you create a merit-based organization, and that's what it really turns into, people and their potential can be exploited for the good. And I'm telling you here that the part about even the Army in 1918, as many problems as it still has, what they did with those segregated units underscored how, at least in that time, a black soldier could be treated the same to some degree as a white soldier. And that's a great lesson. It isn't just that the justice system changed and improved over the next 2 decades. And by the Korean War, because of Truman's desegregation order, blacks were serving alongside whites. I mean, that's a very quick development. In 30 years, we see more progress than we had seen in the previous 150 years in our country or so. But it isn't just that. It's that this is an organization, the military in general, that does create a merit class. And it really makes me proud as an American that we have an organization that has the potential to make us a better society across the board. And that's what the Army was doing. Even in 1918, things changed, and then quickly enough, in 30 years, things changed a whole lot more, and all for the good. At a time, by the way, that the society was really lagging behind the military. So that's what I get out of it. I get the belief that we can do better because we've got a whole history of it right in front of us. And Buchanan talks just about he talks about the leadership. I think about the larger things, and the larger things is how it makes us a better society to have an organization like the Army over those decades, improving, not just defending the country, but improving the lot of everybody in it. It seems that everything in Houston hinged on one man, Snow, and if there had been a better man in his place, that awful mess and the mess that happened here at Fort Sam never would have ended up happening.
Yeah, I can't say that it would have happened differently if you'd have had one person, but I think that it's a demonstration that one person can make an incredible difference. So, in Houston, when you look at Army values, loyalty, duty, respect for others, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage, you can take about any one of those values and take a hard look through that lens at Major Snow and see how poorly he did. And you can contrast that, with the example that we had of Captain Andrews in Waco, who really did try to make a difference. And so I'd argue that the situation there, the conditions were roughly the same in Houston and Waco. There was a riot in Waco, but it was minimal. And that was, I think, largely because of Captain Andrews' leadership, whereas, Major Snow essentially divorced himself from his responsibilities as a leader of the battalion and left in the middle of the melee. And well before, instead of selfless service, he demonstrated that he was all about getting what was due him. A night out in the town, his behavior was very selfish. So, I'm gonna just apply what I would think the response of his men would have been. Captain Andrews' men probably respected him, and they probably did not respect Captain Snow. So when they're in a tough situation, Major Snow. So when they're in a tough situation, and especially when somebody's life is on the line, they're not going to follow somebody unless they respect them. And so to me, that's one of the key differences here. Some people, I know I'm just going to go on here, but some people think that leadership in the military is simple. All you have to do is order people to do things and they'll do it. But it's actually, there's nothing farther from the truth. Leadership in the military can be extraordinarily complex because, most of the time, it's not much of a challenge. If units have discipline, all you have to do is order them to do things and they'll do it. But it emanates from that mutual respect, both up and down the chain of command. And when the cost is really high, like you're asking a bunch of troops to actually put their life on the line, ordering them to do something is not going to motivate them to do it. What ends up motivating them is the respect for the leader, the care, in fact, in love that they will have for their fellow soldiers. That's what causes people to make, sacrifices and to the point of giving up their lives. It's those kinds of things. It's not because they're being ordered to do it.